Do you ever find yourself criticizing another generation for some kind of generational character flaw or failing? I don't know if you ever hear things like this or say things like this, but maybe something like, kids these days just can't get their noses out of their cell phones. Or, what's the matter with these older folks? Can't they see that climate change is a genuine crisis and our planet and our ability to live on it may be in peril? Or, look at those tattoos and piercings. Why would anyone choose to look like that? Or, well, whatever it is that you might be puzzled by or troubled by about some other group, some other age group in particular. That's the idea. Well, in this morning's gospel lesson, Jesus seems to be engaging in that kind of criticism as he addresses a crowd of both followers and skeptics. To what can I compare this generation, Jesus says. And he compares them to these fickle children playing in the marketplace who seem to be acting out the music for a wedding, and they don't get any response from other people in the market. And then they try wailing and mourning like they're pretending to be at a funeral, and they don't get anybody else to play with them for that either. Nobody's listening. Jesus describes a generation that cannot recognize the truth that is right there in front of them. The problem with this generation, Jesus says, is that they aren't going to listen to John the Baptist, and they aren't listening to me. Now, John the Baptist was, we know, kind of an odd figure, and he lived a pretty isolated sort of life, lived out in the desert kind of by himself, and he'd come around people in order to share his thoughts and God's messages for them, and he didn't care what he was dressed in particularly, and he didn't care much about eating. He wasn't a very social kind of guy, but he was a prophetic guy. He was trying to share a message from God about how people should live. Now, some listened, and he did baptize many, but others didn't. And they accused him of being just a little crazy. In fact, some said he was demon-possessed. Well, contrast him then with the prophetic voice of Jesus. And Jesus says, well, you're criticizing for John because he was isolated and didn't care about things like clothes and eating and drinking. And then you criticize me because I am social and I do eat and drink, even with sinners, even with people you wouldn't approve of. So, messengers of God can't win for losing with you people. You are just not paying attention. You always have a critical voice to share. So this generation, Jesus says, finds reason to take offense at both John's ministry and his, and thus they evade the call of God from both men. Jesus says they are like children in the marketplace who can't decide whether they want to play wedding games or funeral games, and they end up playing neither. Now, this interesting description, which is kind of an unusual thing that Jesus talks in this tone of voice, this comes in the midst of a chapter in Matthew where Jesus is being asked by followers of John the Baptist to confirm for them that he is in fact the Messiah. John, who is now in prison, is perhaps hearing some of the doubters about Jesus. He's wanting confirmation of his own belief that Jesus was the Messiah and that he is the leader, in fact, that Jews have been waiting for hundreds of years. But he wants to make sure, and so he sends some messengers to Jesus to simply ask. And Jesus tells them to report back what they have seen, that he can cure the sick and give sight to the blind and forgive sins. Now, the Gospel of Matthew is often referred to as the teacher's gospel. Throughout its chapters, Jesus teaches. In fact, there is more of Jesus' teachings, his words to people, than in any of the other Gospels, by far. There is an emphasis throughout on his teaching ministry, including this passage. He leaves the disciples in Matthew at the end of his time on earth with a directive to go into all of the world and teach all nations. In order for them to teach others, they must first understand. Now we know that teaching facilitates truth becoming wisdom, and teaching reveals to us who Jesus really is. In this passage, Jesus offers respite for the weary, but what we may miss here is that Jesus is also highlighting the importance of his ability to instruct those who will pay attention to him. Though we think of the yoke, he mentions, as equipment for an animal that ties two animals together, pulling a wagon or doing some sort of work, this same piece of equipment was taken even in ancient times in the Old Testament as a rabbinic symbol to refer to the task of obedience to the law, obedience to the Torah. And in order to obey the law, you must know the law. But Jesus is quite often finding himself in conflict with the scribes and Pharisees of the law. And Jesus wants those who are burdened by the law to learn from him, because his approach is different. Rather than being dictatorial and top-down, he says that he has gentle instruction and will enable us to find rest for our souls, to find wholeness and completion. Instructors are guides, and Jesus' guidance is not harsh or arrogant, and therefore obedience to the word should be easier than keeping all those 600 or 700 laws that the Jewish faith has said, these are the things you must do to be a faithful follower of God. Instead, Jesus gives us the example not of doing in the sense of letter of the law, but in being in harmony with Christ and God. And in our being, in our hearts, that is where the true action, the love, comes from. Our pursuit of following Jesus is at the same time a pursuit of his wisdom. But we should remember that it's a wisdom revealed to the humble, to the simple, to the unsophisticated, and even the childlike. It is a wisdom born not of laws and rules, but relationship and caring. Elizabeth Johnson says, Jesus calls us to a life of humble service, but it is a life of freedom and joy instead of slavery to the law. It is a life yoked to Jesus under God's gracious and merciful reign, free from the burdens of sin and the need to prove ourselves, free to rest deeply and securely in God's grace. I can't think of a better place to be. Can you? Amen.